As he was dying in 1957, this evening's author had a message for his friends. Read every day something no one else is reading. Think every day something no one else is thinking. Do every day something no one else would be silly enough to do. It is bad for the mind to continually be part of unanimity. I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. Christopher Morley was born in 1890 and began his writing career in college and then as a publicist for Doubleday. Morley then worked as a newspaper columnist for several New York newspapers. He's also the author of one of my favorite books, Parnassus on Wheels, about an itinerant bookseller traveling the back roads of New York State in the 1910s. The pieces I'm reading this evening are from The Powder of Sympathy, a book that he published in 1923. So let's get started. To a New Yorker 100 years hence. I wonder, old dear, why my mind has lately been going out towards you. I wonder if you will ever read this. They say that wood pulp paper doesn't last long nowadays. But perhaps some of my grandchildren, with any luck, there should be some born, say 25 years hence, may, in their years of tottering cadudicity, come across this scrap of greeting, yellowed with age. With tenderly cynical waggings of their faded polls, perhaps they will think back to the tradition of the quaint, vanished creatures who lived and strove in this city in the year of disgrace, 1921. Poor old Grandfer, I can hear them say it, with that pleasing note of pity. I can just remember how he used to prate about the heyday of his youth. He wrote pieces for some paper, didn't he? Comically old-fashioned stuff, my governor said. Someday I must go to the library and see if they have any record of it. You seem a long way off this soft September morning as I sit here and sneeze. Will hay fever exist in 2021, I wonder? And listen to the chime of St. Paul's ring 11. Just south of St. Paul's brown spire, the girders of a great building are going up. Will that building be there when you read this? What will be the Olympian skyline of your city? Will poor old Columbia University be so far downtown that you'll be raising money to move it out of the congested slums of Morningside? Will you look up, as I do now, to the great pale shaft of Woolworth, to the golden boy with wings above Fulton Street? What ships with new names will come slowly and grandly up your harbor? What new green spaces will your street children enjoy? But something of the city we now love will still abide, I hope, to link our days with yours. There's little true glory in a city that is always changing. New stones, new steeples are comely things, but the human heart clings to places that hold association and remembrance. That, I suppose, is the obscure cause of this queer feeling that impels me to send you so perishable a message. It is the precious unity of mankind in all ages, the compassion and love felt by the understanding spirit for those, its resting kinsmen, who were once glad and miserable in these same scenes. It keeps one aware of that marvelous dark river of human life that runs, down and down uncountably, to the unexplored seas of time. You seem a long way off, I say, and yet it is but an instant, and you will be here. Do you know that feeling, I wonder? So characteristic of our city that a man has in an elevator bound, let us say, for the 18th floor. He sees 5 and 6 and 7 flit by, and he wonders how he can ever live through the interminable time that must elapse before he will get to his stopping place and be about the task of the moment. It is only a few seconds, but his mind can evolve a whole honeycomb of mysteries in that flash of dragging time. Then the door slides open before him, and that instantaneous eternity is gone. He is in a new era. So it is with the race. Even while we try to analyze our present curiosities, they whiff away and disperse. Before we have time to turn 3 times in our chairs, We shall be the grandparents, and you will be smiling at our old-fashioned sentiments. But we ask you to look kindly on this our city of wonder, the city of amazing beauties, which is also, to any man of quick imagination, an actual hell of haste, din, and dishevelment. Perhaps you by this time will have brought back something of that serenity, that reverence for thoughtful things, which our generation lost, and hardly knew it had lost. But even hell, you must admit, always has had its patriots. There is nothing that hasn't, which is one of the most charming oddities of the race. And how we loved this strange, mad city of ours, which we knew in our hearts was, to the clear eye of reason and the pure, sane vision of poetry, a bedlam of magical impertinence, a blind byway of monstrous wretchedness. And yet the blacker it seemed to the lamp of the spirit, the more we loved it with the troubled eye of flesh. For humanity, immortal only in its misery and mockery, loves the very tangles in which it has enmeshed itself, with good reason, for they are the mark and sign of its being. So you will fail as we have, and you will laugh as we have, but not so heartily, we insist. No one has ever laughed the way your tremulous grandfathers did, old chap. And you will go on about your business as we did, and be just as certain that you and your concerns are the very climax of human gravity and worth. And will it be any pleasure to you to know that on a soft September morning 100 years ago, your affectionate great-grandsire looked cheerfully out of his lofty kennel window, blew a whiff of smoke, smiled a trifle gravely upon the familiar panorama, knew, with that antique shrewdness of his, a hawk from a handsaw, and then went out to lunch. Next, children as copy. Titania said, "You haven't written a poem about the baby yet." It is quite true. She is now 13 months old and has not yet had a poem written about her. Titania considers this deplorable. The first baby was hardly a week old before all sorts of literary studies were packing the mails, speeding to such editors as were known to be prompt pay. I hope, indeed I hope, you never saw that astounding essay published anonymously in Every Week, which expired soon after, called The Expectant Father, which was written when the poor urchin was some 24 hours old. It was his first attempt to earn money for his parent. If any child ever paid his own hospital bills, COD, as you might say, it was he. I believe in bringing up my children to be self-supporting. And the second baby was only 3 weeks old when the first poem about her was written. But here is this third morsel, 13 months old, and no poem yet. Titania, I say, considers this a kind of insult to the innocent babe. No, not at all, my dear. I admit that it would be very helpful if H, I will call her that, for baby is a word that cannot be repeated in print very often without all hands growing maudlin, and I don't like to use her own name, which seems too personal. Just remember, then, that H stands for a small brown-eyed creature, who is still listed in the Bureau of Records of the Department of Health, certificate number 43515, Anno Domini 1920, as female Morley, because when the birth was registered by the doctor, her name had not yet been decided. And ever since then, I have been too busy to go around to call on Dr. Copeland, the health commissioner, and ask to have her more specifically enrolled. I admit it would be very helpful if she were to turn to and lend a hand in paying the coal bill by having some verses written about herself. I have looked at her with admiration every day for these 13 months, trying, as one might say, to get some angle on her that would lead to a poem. She does not seem very angular. I insist that my not having written a poem about her is really very creditable. Titania seems to think it implies my having become, in some sense, blasé about children. Again, not so at all. I must confess that in my enthusiasm I rather made use of the 2 older urchins as copy. But H, droll infant that she is too subtle for me. I'll come to that in a minute. I talked all this matter over, being of a cautious turn and fond of getting experienced advice, with two eminent author parents, Mr. Tom Masson and Mr. Tom Daly, long ago before Titania and I began putting on airs. Both these gentlemen have made a lot of use of their children in earning, or at any rate gaining, a living. Their advices coincided. I myself was worried, but Mr. Tom Masson insisted that there was nothing like having offspring as a source of copy. He said that he would pay 10 cents a word in life for anything about the then shortly arriving urchin. He said it would be 15 cents a word if it was a girl, because girls cost you so much more later on. He has had experience in that matter, I believe. Mr. Tom Daly, who has run rather to boys, said very much the same thing, but he was not in a position to buy my stuff, so I paid less attention to him. But to get back to H. There never was a more enchanting infant. Mr. Walter de la Mare, who is also an authority, has written me delightful letters about her, although he has never seen her. But even a prose letter from a poet like Mr. de la Mare is more valuable, I think, than an actual poem from most other poets. So darling H cannot say she has been neglected. But she is much too delicious for me to be able to sit down easily and write something that would do her justice. The night before she was born, her mother and I did two things. We went to Hewler's for a chocolate ice cream soda, and we read aloud Bernard Shaw's Autobiography, which is printed in Frank Harris's Contemporary Portraits. I dislike to bring Mr. Harris into this, for certainly I can think of no one who has less in common with H, that celestial nugget. But I have to tell the truth, don't I? Mr. Harris wrote an essay about Shaw, and Shaw, feeling it was not adequate, wrote a really amusing sketch to show how Harris should have done it. Well, there is really something symbolic about this, for H is as sweet as anything Hewler ever compounded. She's even more enigmatic than Shaw. I can see now it should have been Page and Shaw instead of Hewler. But I feel that pretty soon I shall be writing a poem about her. I have felt it coming for some time. But it has got to come. I am not going to bring it. That shows how I have matured by associating with H. Sometimes I wish I could hire a really great poet to write about her. Swinburne might do for the rough draft. Oh, what a beautiful baby, he used to cry when he saw them in their prams up at Putney. So, I think, Max Beerbohm describes. But I should want to have this rough draft polished and refined by someone else. I can only think that Mr. Walter de la Mare. He alone has just the right insight. For babies 13 months old, the best age of all, must not be treated condescendingly, nor fulsomely, nor adoringly, nor sugarishly. William Blake, if left alone in a room with H, would have understood her. What an infant! I give you my word. Living with children is largely a contest of endurance. It is a question of which one can tire the other out first. This is a great secret, never before made plain. Start early in the morning and take things with a rush. If you are strong, austere, resolute, you may be able to wear them down and exhaust them by dusk. If you can do so without prostrating yourself, then you may get them safely to bed and have a few hours of cheerful lassitude. But take every possible advantage. Let them run and frolic, yourself sitting down as much as you can. Favor yourself and snatch a little rest while they are not looking. Even so, the chances are you will crack first. This applies to older children after they gain the use of their limbs and minds. But H has not reached that harrowing age. Placable, wise, serene, she sits in her crib. She has 4 teeth, beauties. To hear her cry is so rare that I hardly know what her voice of sorrow sounds like. Sometimes, for an instant, she looks a little frightened. Then I like her best, for I know she is human and has in her the general capsule of frailty. You may be quite sure of one thing. I shall never print that poem unless I feel that it comes somewhere near doing her justice. 3. In honorum, Martha Washington. An American figure of national consequence has passed away from the scene of her many glories. We refer to Martha Washington, the Independence Hall cat. When we worked in the good old Philadelphia Ledger office and paragraphs were scarce, we had an unfailing recourse. We would go over to the State House, as they call it in its hometown, descend to the cool, delightful old cellar underneath the hall, and call on Fred Eriksberg, the engineer. We would see Martha sleeking herself on the flagstones by the cellar steps. She was the blackest cat we ever knew, giving off an almost purple luster in the hot sunlight. Or perhaps we would have to search her out among the coal bins, where she was fixing a layette for the next batch of kittens. In any case, Martha having been duly admired, Fred Eriksberg would gladly talk about her and tell us what were the latest adventures of her historic life. Which was always good copy, for Fred, having been on friendly terms with Philadelphia reporters for many years, knew the kind of anecdotes that would please them. One of Fred's unconscious triumphs was the time he told us of his perplexity about ringing in the New Year in the Independence Hall belfry. It was about Christmas time, 1919. Last January, he said, I rang 1919 to welcome in the new year. But what am I going to do this time? How can I ring 192 not? We told him we saw no way out of it but to start early in the afternoon of New Year's Eve and ring the whole 1,920 tolls. We could say a good deal about Martha Washington. Her kittens are surely the most noble in the land. Charter members of the colonial felines of America, all born in the hall, directly underneath the lobby where the bell stands. When the most famous brood of all were swaddled, 4 fine jetty daughters born in November 1918, Fred christened them Victory, Freedom, Liberty, and Independence. He paid us the greatest compliment of our life by offering us victory. But at that time we were living in a small apartment in the city, and we didn't think it would be sufficiently a dignified home for such a kitten, who deserved nothing less than a residence on the main line. Oh, Philadelphia, with scrapple made on the premises. But it is time to get down to the point of our story. Martha has left the hall. Poor Fred, in his bereavement, has taken pen in hand. We can see him sitting at his desk down there in the ancient cellar, with all his emblems, souvenirs, and clippings posted up above him, and an oblong of gold and green brightness shining down through the doorway from the leafy sunshine of the square. We can see him talking it over with his comrades, the boys, the State House carpenter and the gardeners, as they sit at their lunch in the cellar. There's the empty saucer, dry and dusty now. In the good old days, Fred always brought in a little bottle of milk every morning for Martha. And this is what Fred writes us, word for word. Philadelphia, August 3rd, 1921. Dear friend, I thought I would write you a few lines to let you know that I am still in the hall, but the black cat is gone. Without a press agent, Martha just became a cat the boys miss her as we had a bag of grass seed the mice got in, and they have had to hang their lunch on a string, but we have had a pair of robins that sing in the square. They would not be long there if Martha was strolling around. We kept one of her kittens when I was on my vacation. It was sent to the Morris Refuge with one of the men. On a Friday, the next day he got a yellow slip. Goodbye. A lot of people ask me about her, and a friend of yours left this card. Dear friend, it looks as if Martha is going to have a family. Will you save me 2 kittens if they are black like their ma? But she did not have a black kitten, so he did not get one. She left them for a few days, came back when they were sent away. This was what got her in wrong. But when a fight between 2 Thomas cats on the lawn was pulled off, Martha's doom was sealed. She had the same sleek black coat, the same bright eyes, but she was in wrong with our superintendent, so I called up and had a boy from the cat home call for her. They said it would cost 50 cents, so I left the cents and the job of putting her in the basket to one of the men. But her picture is still on the wall. We are making changes and repairs about the building. If the tower would interest you, would be pleased to take you up when over in Philadelphia. We had a party from New York up, and they said they knew you. The old janitor lived in the tower because he had to ring the bell for fires, funerals, and most everything that went on. They tell me one son was born there. He had 3 children. The rafter alongside the open fireplaces burned, and we found some old shoes worn by children under the floor, and some bones we thought meant a crime, but upon investigation turned out to be soup bones from sheep's legs. This is about all. Your friend, Fred Eckersberg, engineer, Independence Hall. Next. According to Hoyle. If it be true, remarks old John Mistletoe in his little-known Life of Edmund Hoyle, that a happy life leaves behind it little material for the biographer, and only those whose careers have been marked by the pangs of ambition and the wearinesses of achievement offer maxims for the moralist, then there is little to be said of Edmund Hoyle. And yet it is odd that a man whose name has become proverbial, who lived to the age of close upon a century, from 1672 to 1769, and who standardized and codified the chief social amusement of his age into an etiquette which remained unchanged for 6 generations. It is odd, I say, that this great, peaceful benefactor has left so slight a trace in biographical annals. For I ask you, which of Hoyle's contemporaries conferred a more placable and sedentary boon upon the world as he? Hoyle, continues Mr. Mistletoe, was a man of very speechless humor. It was his wont to say that he had been lured into the study and metaphysics of whist because it was a silent game. As is well known, the game was originally called whisk. It was Mr. Hoyle who, by his continual utterance of the imperative and hushing monosyllable whist, when gaming with those whose tongues were apt to wag irreverently, caused the diversion, at first only in sport, and then in genuine earnest, to be rechristened. It was a sight not to be forgotten, by contemporary account, to see the master, as he was known, sitting down at the 3 Pigeons Tavern for his afternoon rubber. The morning he spent in tutoring wealthy ladies in the rudiments of the fashionable game, this being the chief source of his income. He was very particular, moreover, as to the standing and rank of his pupils. He was much in demand, and could afford to take only such students as satisfied his fastidious taste for youth and beauty. In fact, he anticipated the doctrine announced many years later by John Keats, who remarked, "I intend henceforth to have nothing to do with the society of ladies unless they be handsome. You lose time to no purpose." It was, I repeat, an agreeable spectacle to witness the master driving up to the 3 Pigeons about the hour of, as we would now say, luncheon, in his white hackney coach with his emblem, the Ace of Hearts, blazoned on the panel. Before the gaming began, he would always take a leisurely meal. Indeed, it was his habit to say that no gentleman would ever spend less than 3 hours at table. One of his humors was to insist that warm weather was dangerous to his constitution, and that in summer it was desirous to eat sparingly and with deliberation. On days that had, as someone has put it, the humidity of Uriah Heep, this was an example of his menu, which I have found filed in the old papers kept in the vaults of the 3 Pigeons. Service to Mr. Edmund Hoyle, this 28th of July, 1730, on account. A capon broth with toasted bread, a flagon of small ale, fricassee of sweetbreads with currant jelly, a flask of cool canary, roasted wild ducks with cheesecake and parsnips, a jug of malmsey from the special butt, a salad of shrimps and candied cherries, a hot rabbit pie with buttered peas and a bottle of mulled claret, rhubarb pasty with barley wine to ease Mr. Hoyle's digestions, plague water for the hot weather. Having done suitable homage to this judicious nourishment, Mr. Mistletoe proceeds, Mr. Hoyle would have brought to him his own yard of clay, which he would leisurely fill with the best pure Virginia leaf, gazing about him the while upon the impatient faces of his friends, who were anxious to get to the cards. Never indulge the carnal appetites immoderately in hot weather, he would say, blowing out a long blue whiff into the cool twilight of the old tap-room, paneled in magnificent dark walnut. This was the last word uttered, for when the master took his seat at the card table, no man dared speak. A sacred quiet filled the place as he reached for the pasteboards and deftly cut for the deal, tossing back his lace cuffs over his lean yellowish wrists. The color, he was something bilious, of old piano keys. The rest was silence, with only the fall of the cards and the occasional clink of a bottle, when Mr. Hoyle refilled his vase of Burgundy, which he always drank while gaming. A life of abstemious control, he said, was needful for one who must keep his wits alert. Next, L.E.W. We are continually obtaining new and piercing glimpses into human life and character. We are now able to assert without fear of rebuttal that even men of unblemished intellect and lofty, serene understanding have always some particular point of frailty at which morals, virtue, and integrity collapse in a dark confusion of spiritual wreckage. Reconsidering the above sentence, it seems to need a little clarification. We shall have to explain what we mean, and can only do so by referring, with painful verity, to the leading editorial writer. L.E.W. came into our kennel yesterday morning and saw lying upon our desk a newly published detective novel that a publisher had sent us. "Oh," he said, "what's this?" and began looking it over. We were rather busy at the moment and paid no particular heed, but looked up a minute later to see him slipping out of our hutch with the book under his arm. "Here," we cried, "what are you doing with that book?" "I'm going to read it," he said with bland composure. "Nothing doing," we asserted sternly. "We began to read it in the subway this morning, and we are just getting interested in it. You'll have to wait until we've finished it." "But you can't read it in the office," he said. "You're too busy." "So are you," we replied. "But we're going to read it tonight. After an exhausting day, we shall need an innocent diversion of that sort." We did not think of it at the time, but we now remembered that there was a curious, evasive luster in his eye. We wish we could make it plain to you how this person, generally a highly cultivated and responsible citizen, occasionally exhibits himself as naively unscrupulous, in a way so charming and unashamed that, with lesser men than ourselves, he successfully gets away with it. A little later in the day, again comes L.E.W. into our nook. He looks about in an absent-minded way, giving much the appearance of the animula, vagula, blandula the Roman emperor told us about. He made one or two random remarks and seemed to be pretending that he had intended to say something important but had forgotten what it was. We may say that we penetrated his game immediately. We kept an eye on him, and as soon as he had retired, we took the detective story and put several newspapers on top of it. But, after all, one cannot sit around the office all day watching the book one is saving for evening reading. By and by, we had to go out to lunch and thought no more about the matter until 5 o'clock. Then, hastily gathering our effects for the trek uptown, we looked for the novel. It was gone. We could not quite believe it at first. We thought we must have mislaid it somewhere on top of the desk. We rummaged briskly. No sign of it. With a sudden vile suspicion, we ran to L.E.W.'s room. He was gone, too. Well, we had to console ourselves in the ride uptown by reading something else. But you know how it is, when you have set your heart on finishing a particular story. This morning, L.E.W. has just come into our coop with his usual enigmatic smile and laid the book before us. We assailed him with bitter reproach and contumely, but we made no impression on him. There is some mysterious knot of villainy in his bosom that leads him to believe that any detective story left within his reach Of course, it is true that writing leading editorials for a number of years may well undermine a man's character. But that is what we mean when we say that even men of unblemished intellect and lofty, serene understanding have always some particular point of frailty at which morals, virtue, and integrity collapse in a dark confusion of spiritual wreckage. We haven't mentioned the title of the book because L.E.W. says it isn't much good. But we are not certain whether that is not just his quaint way of trying to minify the gruesomeness of his offense. It is a perverted form of conscience. He thinks that if he tells us the book is punk, we will not regret that our reading was brutally postponed. But we are going to tell him that he missed a trick there. It would have been much more in line with the delightful humor for which he is famous if he had said, "It's a great yarn. You ought to read it." The end. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, and have a great week.